Hi, and welcome to ThePrint. I'm Karanjeet Kaur, and I'm a columnist at ThePrint. Today, we are talking about the fire tragedy at a Goa nightclub. 25 people have died at a fire at Birch by Romeo Lane in Arpora in North Goa. The incident happened shortly after midnight on December 7th and killed mostly kitchen workers. From initial reports, we know that at least 19 were staff members, along with at least 4 tourists. There were people on the dance floor who rushed to the basement kitchen when the fire broke out and became trapped. Most of them died from suffocation. Now, to set some context, we must understand that Birch is branded as Goa's first island club. It is heavily advertised all along the highway in North Goa. And from what we understand, it was built in a salt pan and apparently flouted multiple regulations. The structure reportedly used flammable temporary materials like wood and palm thatch. This is consistent with attempts to bypass coastal regulation zone norms that prohibit permanent concrete structures in no development zones. The club had no proper fire safety measures and limited access for fire brigade vehicles. We also understand that the local panchayat had issued a demolition order following an ownership dispute, but the Directorate of Panchayats had blocked it. Goa's Chief Minister Pramod Sawant has confirmed that the club was operating illegally and ordered a magisterial inquiry. The club's manager has also been arrested and a warrant issued for the owner. Prime Minister Modi has also announced ex-gratia payments of 2 lakh rupees for families of the deceased. But beyond the immediate tragedy, this fire raises some very uncomfortable questions about how development happens in Goa and who gets to build where, which rules get enforced for whom, and who eventually pays the price when regulations are flouted. To discuss what this tragedy reveals about Goa's political economy of tourism, I'm joined by Kaustubh Naik, a writer and a doctoral student at the University of Pennsylvania. He's based in Goa, and his work examines the tensions between development and the lived realities of both Goans and migrant communities in the state. Kaustubh, let's start with your thread on X this morning. You asked a very important question about who grants permissions for such structures and who benefits while 23 lives are lost. From what we understand, this club was built in a salt pan. So can you walk us through how something like this gets built in the first place and then stays open?
Thank you, Karanjeet, for having me here. And first of all, I would like to extend my condolences to all the dead people who've lost their lives in this tragedy, which could have been easily avoided. And I hope that they don't join the list of people, whose deaths nobody are held accountable for. I hope that there is some sort of political action that happens on this. Especially that this is probably the second tragedy that we've seen in Goa after the Lairai stampede that happened in Shirgaon few months back. And I was just talking to somebody saying that that the stampede itself should have triggered some sort of safety audit for public spaces in Goa, especially leading up to December, because it's a very busy month for locals as well as for tourism. And given, like, I was just going through all the details of the dispute of that property, and it seems like this could have been really avoided. Coming back to your question, how does this kind of permission happen? As we know that there is a certain there's a certain kind of planning that was put in place in Goa that mapped the entire state, which is a very unique form of urban planning that happened in Goa. And that is what creates Goa the way it is. That there are these urban pockets, and there are these patches of, like, there is a vast spreads of greenery, that these were meant to be preserved. And there were like certain areas in the Goan sort of territory were sort of a no-go for development, and they are identified as such. Subsequently, when the tourism started sort of placing more demands on the Goan terrain, these norms have been flouted first by, it's right from the town and country planning department themselves, but more and more nodal agencies have come in to sort of flout these norms. There is the Goa Tourism Development Corporation, there is the Industrial Promotion Board, and this kind of en masse conversion of orchard on agricultural or eco-sensitive land into commercial, converting that land for commercial purpose. And this is sold to us in the name of development. It is sold to us in the name of that, we need to create more jobs and this that, but it eventually sort of is now claiming lives of locals and everybody who comes to sort of reside in this state. So there is it the CM has just probably made a statement that the responsibility will be fixed on the owner of the club, but I think that it lies with a collective there's a collective responsibility of the state also. And people, and knowing that this structure was illegal, there's a active court dispute around the legality of this structure. And so the owner also cannot just say that he did not know that the structure was illegal. The more I dig about this case, it just gets murky, and it just feels sorry for the lives that have been lost.
Since you've brought up the fact that multiple agencies were involved in this, how do you, and the fact that the Directorate of Panchayats had blocked a demolition order, but the Town and Country Planning Department had actually allowed the construction in the first place, and the fact that the club was operating without fire safety compliance. The point is that the responsibility is so diffused. So how do you even begin to hold anyone accountable in a case like this?
Yeah, because see, despite our best efforts, I was thinking that this is not a bug in the system, but this is a feature of the system. That these systems are designed to sort of produce irregularities of which people can informally benefit. That this I'm sure there is some sort of greasing of hands across regulatory authorities, and people have been openly saying that. So now the blame game will shift. Like people will point fingers that this, as you rightly pointed out, there is a demolition order going back to April 24. Like there's more than one, like it's almost 2 years now that the demolition order is in place, but the director of panchayat has sort of put a stay on it, and there's nothing has happened. Meanwhile, the at least they should have stopped the operations of this club, if at all, but even that did not happen. So I'm sure people are benefiting from these irregularities. How do you bring them to be accountable? I don't know, like at what point, because accountability as such has become such a rare thing from this government itself, that even when so many lives are lost, one wonders if there will be anybody who sort of will have some conscience to sort of act out of any moral responsibility for this.
Let's talk a little bit about the use of temporary materials like wood and palm thatch, which, from what I understand, this is like a known loophole in, to avoid CRZ restrictions on a permanent structure. How common do you think is this practice in, other structures that are not just in the same lane as Romeo Lane, but also, spread all across Goa's coast?
I think it's very rampant. If you go and see some the shacks that are sort of erected across across the coastline, also use these materials, because I mean, they create a certain aesthetic of like rusticness and antique or whatever, but they also are used to legally flout some of the structural requirements of the buildings itself. That you can always say that these are temporary structures, because even in orchard lands, you are allowed to erect like a small temporary structure for dwelling, which is not a pakka house, but and people use these sort of legal sort of loopholes to bypass some regulations, and this is across the state. You would see these kind of flouting of regulations, and what happened today is just a result of that. It's very common. Just to say that it's probably more common than we think it is.
You've also mentioned that there was no proper access for fire brigade vehicles. This is also a known problem for not just clubs and bars and restaurants, but also for residences in Goa, right?
Yeah, and because some of these roads are like older roads, they cannot be widened because there are already properties across both sides, and it could also be that some of these roads are actually like pavements in a field, for example, which have been later converted into roads. So there is a restriction on how wide these roads can be. So narrow roads are a thing in Goa, which is also again is romanticized in one sense. And for whatever time that I've been to that side of Arpora, Vagator, and all these places, you realize that they're just one tragedy away from, like, yeah. And I was just drawing that thing from a report that one of the local channels filed today, that the fire brigade had to stand at least 400 meters away from the site to throw the water, because there was no way that was leading to the club, and that created the further delay in extinguishing the fire.
Tell us a little bit about the fact that beyond fire safety, what are the broader environmental and social costs of allowing tourism infrastructure in these eco-sensitive zones? We've seen one example, but beyond
Yeah.
that, what other scenarios could we be looking at?
I mean, this very club was also alleged of like throwing all its sewage into the Baga River and the Shapura River, that it was in the water body that it was sort of built around. So there is that there is this unchecked sort of garbage disposal of all these restaurants in the rivers, that fills up the water body. Sometimes these they create they sort of create toxic waste within the water that goes into the field. And there is like somebody's lack of responsibility has a major impact on the entire neighborhood itself. Also, there are instances of noise pollution. I There is a model of code of conduct in place in the state due to the Jilla Panchayat elections, and I'm wondering how, like, I'm just wondering if it has no bearing on till what time these clubs remain open in the night, because there is clearly you cannot sell alcohol beyond the point when the
Yeah,
model
dry days
conduct
have been
code.
announced already in advance.
Exactly. So, noise pollution is one thing, and sometimes you wonder that if these regulations are just like some cash, like, if you just hand out some cash and they just disappear in the ether, you know, and I'm sure there are more ways in which people have flouted these norms.
Let's talk a little bit about how clubs and bars and this entire ecosystem also affects the lives of residents. I believe it was last year that residents of Anjuna had complained about the rising levels of noise pollution thanks to the clubs and bars around.
Yeah, I don't have the first hand experience of it because I stay in a very different locality of Goa, which is so far away from these clubs. But what I gather is that this is a very constant problem, and it's not just the noise pollution, but the kind of vibe it creates of like fights, of brawls, and this it
A
the
vitiated
entire
atmosphere.
yeah, the entire atmosphere around these clubs and all is always people either see them with suspicion or with fear. There's this whole parallel industry of what are called as the bouncers, who are like created who restrict now entry of locals or people that they don't want into these spaces. It's like it has spiraled into like things that probably the locals have absolutely no control over, and yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the people who've died. And the state is now obviously promising inquiries and audits. But we know that the club was operating with known kind of violations. Um, are you hopeful that this will translate into some action now that a tragedy of this scale has occurred, and also because certain tourists were involved? Or do you think this will go the way of other such tragedies?
I have no hopes, to be very frank, because the kind of people who are involved in this, their pockets are very deep, their connections are very deep. So and people who benefit from these kind of irregularities are actually sitting in the government. The CM might say anything in to avoid avoid any humiliation today, but it's not that that they are not responsible for this. So I'm sure that somebody will be scapegoated, like some eyewash. There will be some eyewash regarding some arrest being made, but eventually these things will die out in a news cycle. I have zero hope from any for any accountability from this government.
Right. What would real accountability also look like over here, beyond just arresting a manager or the owner or issuing a new sort of guideline? What exactly do you think should this accountability really look like?
I think we should go to the very core of the problem, is that how there should be real restrictions placed on these zone chainings that happen, changing of zones that happen in Goa at a rampant scale. And everybody's complicit in that, right from the government, the TCP department, people who work for it, the panchayats. So the real accountability would come by putting stringent measures through which coastal sensitive zones, eco sensitive zones cannot be changed into commercial or and non-agricultural categories, so that buildings could be erected around it, just because that puts safety of everybody involved at risk. So probably we'll have to start from there, is like, how do we protect a certain code of planning that was implemented in the first round of planning that happened in Goa, and probably we stay true to that, because if not, then Goa as we know today will eventually sort of start disappearing amidst this the crowd of concrete structures around.
Thank you. I think we have about all we require for the interview. So thank you so much for joining us, Kaustubh, and we leave you with
Thank you
this.
for thank you for having me.